President Lee Jae Myung is hosting his first foreign counterpart, Vietnamese Party General Secretary To Lam, at the top office here in Seoul. We have details up next. Hello, welcome to Press Perspective for this Monday, August 11th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. The leaders of South Korea and Vietnam sat down for their first summit earlier on this Monday morning. And for details on that meeting, I have Steven Borowiec with Japanese weekly news magazine Nikkei Asia here in the studio. Steven, hope you had a great weekend.
I did, but I'm glad to be here.
Right. I also have freelance journalist Michael Tatarski, based in Vietnam, live on the line. Michael, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Happy to be here.
Right, Steven, we will start here in the studio. Let's begin with details of what has been disclosed about the discussions during the summit between President Lee Jae Myung and his Vietnamese counterpart, To Lam.
Well, the two leaders put out a statement earlier today where they flagged intentions to kind of escalate or step up their already quite fruitful ties. I think they set, if I remember correctly, they set the goal of having bilateral trade reach the $150 billion level, and I believe last year it was 86.7 billion. So you see that this is an already quite robust relationship, but they're looking to take it to a whole other level. And in the release that Lee's office put out, they flagged potential cooperation in critical minerals, in railways, in the construction of like what in Korea are called shindoshi, or like new towns, new kind of residential developments. And so it seems to me that what they're doing is, South Korea is further along the economic development path than Vietnam is. So it seems to me like, in one sense, this relationship is South Korean firms trying to kind of apply what they've learned and like apply their technology and apply their commercial know-how to areas of need in Vietnam. And Vietnam is a growing market. It's been one of the fastest growing economies in Asia, if not perhaps the world, over the past 5 or 10 or 20 years. And so I think that the bilateral relationship contains a fair bit of mutual complementarity. Is that a word? It's mutually complementary in a few different areas. But just one other thing that I would flag that I thought was interesting was in the press release from President Lee Jae Myung's office, one thing that they mentioned was changes in the world order. And the release didn't specify what these changes were, but like we can kind of speculate that this might have something to do with the trade tensions that are taking place around the world, like the various conflicts around the world. This is a time when I think all countries, but particularly an export-oriented country like South Korea, it might make sense to seek new partners. It might make sense to try to deepen partnerships that already exist, try to find new areas where they can cooperate, and kind of make an outward and a public showing of partnership, of saying that we have this bilateral relationship and they are choosing to not be encumbered by the trade complications that are arising around the world, that they are going to continue along this path of freer trade and freer engagement, that they are lowering barriers to economic interchange instead of raising them, as is happening in some other parts of the world. So all in all, there's quite a bit to discuss.
Right. We've also been told, that is, speaking about trade, Stephen, we've also been told that the Vietnamese delegation's agenda here in South Korea includes active interaction with the corporate leaders of South Korea. What's the latest on that front?
Well, Lee's office said that there are 10,000 Korean companies that are operating in Vietnam, which just sounds to me like a very impressive number. I mean, I would have a hard time naming 100 Korean companies off the top of my head, but to think that there are that many who have gone to invested the expense and the time and everything that it takes to set up overseas, it's quite impressive. So as part of today's events was a kind of who's who of the top ranks of South Korean business brass. I believe that present today was SK Chairman Jae Tae-won, Hyundai Chairman Jung Il-sun, LG Group Chairman Gu Kwang-mo, and several others. So To Lam, the Vietnamese leader, was traveling here with a quite extensive business delegation. I mean, I don't know the numbers exactly, but he was here with, I think, a lot of the representatives of the decision makers and the influential people in his country when it comes to government and when it comes to the private sector. Vietnamese firms who already have extensive ties with South Korean firms and those who are looking to develop them. So by all indications, that will a lot of that will be taking place kind of off the, out of the public eye. These will be private meetings, private discussions, but the summit looks to be a chance for a lot of deals to get done and a lot of more areas of mutual need to be addressed.
Right, and before we delve into those areas, then Michael, what can you share with us about the response there in Vietnam with regard to the state trip to South Korea by its leader?
Yeah, this trip has been getting pretty prominent coverage in media here. It's worth noting the fact that To Lam, the General Secretary, is the one undertaking this trip. His predecessor didn't travel overseas at all in kind of his last years. He passed away last year, wasn't traveling overseas due to his age and poor health. And generally the state president would travel overseas, but now To Lam has sort of, and since he took power in August last year, has been doing the trips to Vietnam's major partners, such as South Korea. So that's noteworthy in and of itself. And yeah, South Korea, of course, is seen as one of the major economic partners for Vietnam. I believe they are each other's third largest trade partners. South Koreans make up the largest expatriate community here in the country, here in Vietnam. Samsung has a huge presence. I think it alone has invested $20 billion here. So South Korea has it's very high profile here, and this visit is seen as just a further continuation of this already tight partnership.
Right. Stephen, in an interview with Vietnamese state-run news agency VNA, President Lee Jae Myung, among other aspects, highlighted the bilateral partnership, of course, on the trade front, as we mentioned earlier. For the sake of context, could you tell us a bit more about the economic cooperation between the two countries?
Sure. There's a couple of things that I think are worth noting. I think that if you look at the contours of the relationship, it's kind of an interesting combination of a country that has is at the same time a growing consumer market. So it's a market for South Korean goods and South Korean services, but it's also a place where a lot of South Korean firms have deemed it beneficial to set up shop, and like that has to do a lot with the skilled and relatively inexpensive Vietnamese labor force. So we have these two things happening kind of at the same time. I mean, I think economic cooperation between them on the private sector level really started to take off, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, when a lot of South Korean firms were relocating out of China and also out of South Korea, looking for places that they could operate that were had access to cheap and readily available labor, and was kind of geographically conveniently enough located within the major shipping lanes and all the other kinds of logistical things that are necessary for these firms to prosper. And since that, I believe that, I think Michael might have mentioned this, that South Koreans are the largest source of inbound tourists to Vietnam. I mean, I've not been to Vietnam in a number of years, but like I've heard that there are these resorts, or there are these towns where if you go there, they're almost like little kind of Korea towns set up to cater to the large numbers of Koreans coming into them. And at Nikkei Asia, we had some reporting earlier this year that was about all of this kind of niche economy that has sprouted in Vietnam, where in these places you have Vietnamese firms that exist to provide housing to Koreans, to provide transportation to Koreans, all these different ways in which the growing influx of Koreans has created opportunities for Vietnam. And at the same time, we should note that there's a fair number of Vietnamese people who live and work in South Korea, a lot of workers on the temporary visas who work in agriculture, manufacturing, and a number of other areas. So there's, again, we're just coming back to this theme that these are two countries who have found ways of interacting that are doing good things for both of them.
Right. And Michael, going back to the interview I was talking about earlier, what would you choose to highlight, perhaps, as some of the key takeaways from the comments shared by President Lee Jae Myung with VNA?
Yeah, I mean, one well, sort of amusing part related to the tourism that that was just mentioned. He mentioned a joke where comparing Da Nang, the coastal city that's popular here in Vietnam, as a tourist destination. Sometimes this can be confused with Korean provinces because there's just so many people from South Korea there. So a bit of just a funny part. But otherwise, I think him highlighting things like nuclear power, high-speed rail, and other forms of infrastructure. These are major planks of Vietnamese government's growth goals. Over the past few months, they've outlined incredibly ambitious, some may say slightly unrealistic, but bold, no doubt, plans for high-speed rail and nuclear energy development. Those are areas that South Korea has experience in. Of course, the Vietnamese are also talking about those issues with the Russians, China, United States, Japan, France, other countries that also have such infrastructure. But South Korea is certainly a potential partner in some of those projects, along with, expressways, urban metros, you name it. So highlighting some of those sort of big ticket infrastructure and tech projects was noteworthy as well.
Right. And President Lee Jae Myung also spoke about how people-to-people exchanges between Vietnam and South Korea form the bedrock of deeper ties, Stephen, and I'm quoting him. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
I believe, looking at the documents from President Lee's office this afternoon, he also said that there were something like 100,000 international marriages between the two countries, and so he said that South Korea and Vietnam were almost like a nation of in-laws, which I thought was another kind of a clever quip. And it does speak to something real. If we really want the two countries to understand each other, then these kinds of people-to-people exchanges are necessary. It's great to have people going to Vietnam and experiencing the beauty of the country and the food and the sights and smells and all of that, and coming away with a greater familiarity that way. But it would probably also behoove the leaders of the two countries to come up with, whenever we see these diplomatic engagements, we hear a lot about like future-oriented exchanges. There's nothing more future-oriented than engaging in youth. So it will probably make sense for both sides to try to find out how they can get more students studying at the other countries' universities, trying to get more delegations of young people going back and forth, maybe playing sports or maybe engaging in cultural areas like dance or the visual arts or whatever it happens to be, just inculcating some kind of direct familiarity with the cultural traditions in both countries. I think that's the softer side of diplomacy that often doesn't get as much play at meetings like this. We tend to focus on, the bigger ticket items of infrastructure and business deals and things like that for good reason, but there's more to be achieved, and it's encouraging to see that President Lee and To Lam both have these kinds of things in mind.
Right. Michael, then, simply speaking, what do you suppose are perhaps the diplomatic implications of this state trip for the Vietnamese leader, keeping in mind, of course, the current state of geopolitics and trade amid Mr. Donald Trump's approach to ties with America's partners?
Yeah, this is a continuation of Vietnam's bamboo diplomacy, which is the term coined by To Lam's predecessor, who I mentioned, who passed away last year. Basically saying that they will try to bend but not break, and given all of the geopolitical tensions going on, it seems like there's a new crisis breaking out somewhere on a weekly basis at this point. And also a key part of that is attempting to be, this may be simplifying it, but more or less friends with everybody. There's Vietnamese government has a staunch policy of no formal alliances with any country, but they frequently welcome visiting heads of state from around the world, in addition to their own leaders going overseas. Again, South Korea is a particularly important part of this, but it's all a part of their bamboo diplomacy and wanting to have a role in a lot of different issues, and also friendly relations with as many countries as possible.
Michael, this is an impromptu question, but with regard to Mr. Trump's tariff campaign, what is the response there in Vietnam? I believe Vietnam is facing a higher tariff rate than South Korea.
Yeah, so the Trump administration has landed on 20%, which is a reduction, if you will, from the originally announced 46%, which came as an absolute shock here. The U.S. is Vietnam's largest export market. I think exports to the U.S. make up roughly 30% of Vietnam's GDP. So if 46% had come into effect, that would have been quite devastating here. Of course, 20% is still much higher than the previous 0%. So I don't think people are very happy about that either. But it is generally seen as it shouldn't impact Vietnam's competitiveness, too much. Some other peer countries like Indonesia are 19% tariff rates. But of course, it's frustrating. And I'm sure South Korea feels similar frustrations.
Right. Stephen, back to the summit between President Lee Jae Myung and his Vietnamese counterpart, To Lam. What do you suppose the significance of this first summit for the president here on the home ground, of course, because the actual summit that was his first was with the Japanese leader on the sidelines of the G7 in Canada earlier this year. So what is the diplomatic significance of this particular summit on the home ground for President Lee Jae Myung?
I think we can say a few things. I think that for President Lee, hosting the Vietnamese leader as the first foreign leader that he's hosting is kind of apt and quite advantageous in a few ways that I'll try to get into here. Like, for one thing, I would say it's interesting that it's not one of what in Korean diplomatic circles are generally considered like the big three country, which is China, the U.S., and Japan. All three of those countries come with a lot of historical baggage, a lot of the trade and the defense and the diplomatic ties are like so extensive and so long established and so complicated with all three of those countries. I mean, in the case of the U.S., you have an alliance that is currently in a kind of a newly fraught state. China and Japan are of course not allies and have their own kinds of histories of valuable cooperation at certain times and then quite bitter conflict at other times. With Vietnam, I mean, as we've been saying, it's a country where there's a lot of opportunity, where South Korea has, arguably its most fruitful ties ever. You can argue that the bilateral ties between the two of them are better than they've ever been. And we heard about Vietnam's bamboo diplomacy. Lee has been calling his diplomatic approach national interest-based diplomacy. I think in Korean would be gugik wegyo, which sounds a little bit fresher and snappier than national interest or pragmatic diplomacy. Lee has just been saying that in contrast with how his predecessor functioned, in contrast with how some previous South Korean administrations functioned, he is going to parse every diplomatic encounter, every bilateral relationship, every multilateral engagement through the prism of how does this serve South Korea's national interests? Is this something that's going to benefit South Korea? Is this something that's going to, present benefits to the South Korean public? And Vietnam provides, I think, a very strong case where Lee can demonstrate that. Lee can say that engagement with Vietnam has created South Korean jobs. Engagement with Vietnam has, has become like a very important market, both for production facilities and for sales to a lot of South Korean companies. And so he can uphold Vietnam as an example of perhaps what he might want to accomplish in other countries. He might be able to say the way that we've engaged with Vietnam is an appropriate example for how we might engage with other kind of up-and-coming economies, or like as an example we might present to some of our older or more established partners as a kind of template for how we wish to engage going forward. So I think it was a smooth and a well-selected diplomatic debut on the home front for Lee.
Right. Michael, Vietnam, it's poised to host the annual APEC Forum in 2027. What do you suppose will it seek to take away from South Korea's hosting of the event later this year?
I think it will hope to continue whatever is accomplished at the summit, the upcoming summit in South Korea. I know Vietnam's theme is connecting, building inclusive and resilient economies, which sort of echoes the Korean theme for this year. Vietnam they're undergoing a huge airport expansion for Phu Quoc, the island where the Leaders Week will take place, and I think Vietnam will want to show that it can play a role, or is playing a role, in high-level regional diplomacy, and build on what the leaders accomplish in South Korea.
Right, and staying with the upcoming APEC gathering, Stephen, what factors do you suppose look to determine the success of this multilateral economic gathering for South Korea?
I would say two things. I would say, first of all, it just comes down to who attends. And that's always a bit of a crapshoot when it comes to these things, because these are all very, these are world leaders who are all very important and could at any time have things to tend to at home or in different parts of the world, and they sometimes can't commit super early. And I know that makes it really hard to plan, because some world leaders will hedge their own participation on who else is going to be there. So we'll have to wait and see with that. And then I think the second thing is probably just how difficult or how easy it is to broker consensus among whoever is there. I've covered a few of these kind of large diplomatic gatherings, and what you always hear in the corridors as these things are going on is like how the challenges that the organizers are facing in getting participants to agree to certain language. Is there something that's going to be included, or are you going to have to leave it out? And if you include it, is there like a certain hot button adjective or noun that you can't use? So all of that remains to be seen, but I'm sure that the South Korean organizers are working quite hard to deal with those, kind of minimize those potential complications as much in advance as they can.
All right, as we look forward to that gathering, I believe in August 31st until November 1st. Right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Stephen, as always, thank you very much for your time and thoughts. And Michael, over in Vietnam, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching, and do join us again same time tomorrow. That is Tuesday, for more panel discussion.